1948. A famine forces thousands to seek their fortunes elsewhere. Among these immigrants was George H. Tennant, the founder of Tennant Company.
George Tennant was born in Ireland, but he only lived there for 2 years because his family, like many Irish families at the time, left Ireland in 1848 at the time of the first Great Potato Famine. And they moved to the United States, the New World, and he grew up in western New York State. At about that time, the United States was expanding rapidly, and the cry was, "Go west, young man." So when George Tennant was still in his teens, he did go west, and he ended up in St. Louis, Missouri, a booming river town. He stayed there a couple of years, and then he went up the Mississippi River to the new community of Minneapolis.
He looked around and saw that the area was beginning to grow. The lumber industry was just starting, and people would need floors in the houses that were going up all over the place. He started the G.H. Tennant Company, a one-man sawmill to make wood flooring. Over the next 30 years, the company grew to about 40 people and was the largest maker of hardwood flooring in the area. Many old homes in South Minneapolis still have George Tennant's maple, oak, and birch planking on the floors.
Wood mills had a way of burning down, and he had 2 fires by the time the turn of the century arrived. After the second fire, the insurance company wouldn't cover him anymore, so he was on his own. And unfortunately, one day, while he was attending a fireman's picnic in an August day in 1903, the third fire in his mill occurred, and he was to the wall. Fortunately, he was able to raise some money from his neighbors and friends, and he then went back in business as a corporation, and instead of a sole proprietorship, and he called it the G.H. Tennant Company.
In 1911, George Tennant passed away. The business struggled as the forests receded and freight rates changed, making the flooring business more difficult. However, the company already had a culture of survival, and it struggled with various kinds of wood products, including milk bottle crates and wooden downspouts, led by E.M. Pennock, George Tennant's son-in-law.
By 1930, the company was almost out of business, and then one day there was quite a change in their fortunes. The school janitor, a fellow named Ben Casper, had invented a way to dry clean floors.
Mr. Casper said, "You fellows make the floors and I maintain them. The fact is, wood floors should not be mopped. They should be dry cleaned, and I've invented a device to do just that." His device was basically steel wool wrapped around a coffee can. Mr. Pennock was interested in the idea, bought the patent, and the company started in its new direction. However, it was not easy.
My father had married one of Mr. Tennant's granddaughters, and he started working for the company even though they only had 5 employees at the time, and he was, in fact, their sole sales force.
Hale was extremely interested in this new idea of the dry floor cleaning machine and asked Mr. Pennock if he could move to the eastern part of the United States to try and sell this machine directly to customers with large expanses of wood floors, namely bakeries and mills. Mr. Pennock reluctantly said yes, and Lloyd Hale spent the years between 1933 and 1937 visiting every bakery and textile mill he could find in the eastern part of the United States. This difficult period was a crucial turning point for Tennant. In hindsight, it is obvious that the company would shift from making wood flooring to making floor cleaning machines. However, for about 7 or 8 years, there was a bitter struggle within the company as to whether this was a prudent thing to do. Fortunately, the new product direction began to take off toward the end of the 30s, and a crucial competitive advantage, direct selling, evolved for Tennant almost as a fluke.
By the end of the 1930s, the company had some momentum in the floor cleaning business, and then the Second World War came along, and like most companies in the United States, it redirected its efforts to support the war effort. In the case of Tennant Company, they became a subcontractor to Honeywell, who was the prime contractor on the Nordson bomb site, and Tennant made parts for them. But right after the war, they went back to making floor cleaning equipment, and many exciting things were happening then in American industry. We had a sales force who was selling direct, and they knew where the customers were, and a man named Orville Hognander had been selling floor buffing equipment into the large automobile plants in Michigan, and he said what these people really need to do is sweep their floors. But they can't sweep the floors because the only way to control dust is to spray water on the floor, and they don't want to do that. And he said if we could make a vacuumized power sweeping machine, then we would really have something.
Ralph Peabody, an engineer at Tennant, designed such a machine, obtained a patent, and in 1947, Tennant made its first vacuumized sweeper, the first such machine in the world. Thus, the company moved from small buffing and sanding machines to large power sweeping machines. Meanwhile, the direct sales were growing, and in 1950, the company even sold its first overseas machine to the Swiss railway system, starting it on its way to becoming an international company despite its small size. In 1950, the company's total sales were approximately $3 million. As sales grew, so did the number of people who worked for Tennant.
I was going out toward the shop, and I met Lloyd Hale coming back from the shop. And he looked so crestfallen. I asked him, Lloyd, what's the matter? You look so sad. He said, well, we're just getting too big. We're getting too big. I no longer can remember the names and the birthdays of all the people, the children of the men out in the shop.
During the 1950s and 1960s, the business grew, expanded the direct sales force, the product line, and made further inroads into international markets. A license agreement was signed with a Dutch company, R.S. Stokvis, and Tennant licensed products were manufactured in Europe for those markets.
Not long after that, in 1964, we established a relationship in Japan, a joint venture with Fuji Heavy Industries. We created a company called Fuji Tennant, and Fuji Tennant manufactured or licensed in Japan and sold machines throughout Japan, where we have been now for well over 25 years.
1969 and 1970 were extremely important turning points for Tennant. In 1969, the company went public, and employees were able to purchase stock. In hindsight, it is quite clear that Tennant would not have been able to survive as an independent company if it had not gone public at some point. Death and taxes would have certainly forced the company to sell without the liquidity of a public market.
The third major thing that happened during that era was the acquisition of our European license arrangement. We had had the license arrangement with Stokvis for many years. It had been successful, but we made what was then a rather bold move, which was to jump over a joint venture which they wanted into a wholly owned subsidiary. We bought out the license agreement and established a European operation in 1970. That operation was called Tennant NV and has been a terrific success for us during the 20 years of its existence.
Tennant was able to go into the direct service business by acquiring a Michigan company.
In the late 1970s, business was booming. We were doing extremely well, and there was a lot of pressure on suppliers, and we were not able to meet our shipments on time. The quality from our suppliers was not adequate, and we began to worry about this. At about the same time, I had this experience in Japan, which has been told a million times, but it's my favorite story about quality, and that was when I visited a Japanese customer, asked them how they liked our products, which they were importing from Minneapolis, and they said, well, we like the product except for those little oil leaks on the floor. I thought that was odd because we were making those same machines, selling them in Chicago and Cleveland, and I came back and said, why are the machines leaking in Osaka and Fukuoka but not Chicago and Cleveland? And everybody looked into it, and we found out that in fact they were leaking in Chicago and Cleveland, but nobody was complaining about it. The Japanese were complaining. From that we learned something, and that was standards of quality are different in different parts of the world, and that began to wake us up.
The 1980s were an extremely difficult period for most American businesses, including Tennant. There was a recession in 1980, followed by a feeble and false recovery in 1981, followed by a very severe recession in 1982. During the next few years, many of Tennant's major customers in American heavy industry were downsizing, restructuring, and generally feeling the severe aftershocks of the 1980-82 recessions. During the latter part of the 80s, American business was afflicted by the scourge of takeover. Many decent companies were overrun by speculators and financiers whose primary motivation was to gobble up companies, cut them into smaller pieces, and walk away with a great deal of profit. Despite all the turbulence during the 1980s, Tennant kept improving its quality, maintained a sound and conservative balance sheet, added new products, and managed to maintain its long tradition of independence and survival.
We've worked very hard during the past 10 years to develop a very strong program in product specification quality and product reliability quality, and we've really accomplished a lot in that. I'm very proud about that, and I think everybody else at Tennant should be also. But during the past 2 years, we have realized that we have to move to a higher level, and that has to do with the customer. Customer-focused quality. What does the customer want? What are their needs? What do we know about them? And how can we meet and even exceed their expectations? And what we're trying to do is to be the preeminent company in the world in floor maintenance equipment and related products. With a strong quality effort at Tennant, we can do that.